In Pattaya, Thailand, there were these two young brothers who were 13 and 8. They were at their favorite local internet cafe to play some games, hang out, have some fun. As these two brothers were gaming, one of them felt a tap on their shoulder, and when they turned to look, it was just another boy around the same age as them, and he seemed really kind, really fun, and they all start kind of talking and gaming together. This boy would actually mention that he was actually on his way to his friend's house who owns a way better computer than any of the computers at this internet cafe, along with better games and better Wi-Fi, because I can imagine the Wi-Fi at an internet cafe is probably not the best. And so this young boy was kind of like, I'm heading over there. I'm a little nervous. I don't really want to walk by myself. Do you guys want to walk with me or do you guys want to come by? The brothers were kind of like, sure, why not? It wasn't that far from the internet cafe. And, this kid was the same age as them. So it's not like some guy in a van being like, I have candy. So they all excitedly walk with this boy to the house. It wasn't that far, like I said. And, they were finally excited because they were like, oh my God, I cannot wait to play some games. But when they entered into this apartment, it was really dark, it was dingy, it wasn't really exciting, but this simple walk would change their entire lives forever. There was no computer, but there was a man who was known as Mr. Swirl Face. Mr. Swirl Face was a predator online who would take photos of young boys and share them on the internet. He was actually highly respected among other predators because he was in all of his photos. Unlike a lot of other predators, they won't really show their face because they obviously do not want to get caught by the police. But because of this man, he was really confident enough, but he was known as Mr. Swirl Face because he would swirl his face by using some kind of software. It seemed like he had this high confidence, but his confidence would be one of his biggest downfalls. But even though this man would be caught, the Canadian government would still go on to fail the victims of Mr. Face. And today, we're going to discuss who he was and what happened and how Canada failed. Hi, welcome to the Decomposing Flower podcast. I'm your host, Jen. With me is Kira. In this podcast, we talk about all different things, whether it's true crime, cults, mysteries. If you have a case for us, let us know in the comments, or you can fill in our Google form. All the information we find is online and shared for educational purposes. If anything we say is wrong, or you also want to add to the conversation, or we leave something out, feel free to let us know in the comments below. Anything we say is our own opinion, so we don't speak for anyone. So before we begin, I want to mention that I am going to be referring to CP as CSM or CSEM, which stands for Child Exploitation Material or Child Exploitation Sexual Material. A lot of professionals will use this term over CP because the term CSEM puts the victim first. And according to a special agent who works in Homeland Security, CP tends to take away the actual seriousness of the crime and focuses a lot more on what is happening and doesn't go into the actual abuse. So I am going to be referring to it as CSEM just so we're on the same page. But yeah, I've just been seeing a lot of people saying that a lot of professionals are really wanting people to use this term more than CP. So in 2004, there were these German police officers and they were kind of sorting through some forgotten old storage units. And as they looked through the abandoned unit storage, they found a USB that was still plugged into a computer. And obviously, they're like, okay, we should probably check this out. There was nothing interesting on this USB. There was just hundreds of photos of food and travel and stuff from different countries in Asia. And they were just like, oh, it's nothing really interesting. Until they found something incredibly sinister. They found child exploitation sexual material. They were shocked to say the least, but I mean, maybe this is something that police potentially are used to seeing, although I'm not too sure. So in this USB, they actually found it was really incredibly organized and it was labeled down to 3 victims. In these photos, there were these 3 young boys in a dark, dingy apartment being sexually abused by a man, except these photos were a lot different than a lot of photos you might see. In most child abuse material, you don't usually see the abuser. They will do everything in their power to stay away and hide their faces or their bodies or parts that might give them away. Except this man didn't. He was in all of the photos, posing with all of these victims, almost as if he was taunting the police and even showing other abusers, look at me, look how confident I am. Now, you're probably thinking, okay, yeah, this is easy. This is a done case. They can probably just find this guy. But this man made sure to completely swirl his face to the point he was unidentifiable, and the police really struggled to unswirl his face. They even tried to get the pixels back, but they couldn't. So the German police ended up enlisting Interpol, which is an international crime stopping organization where they have a special unit dedicated to child abuse cases. So Interpol began using a lot of context clues in these photos, trying to figure out a location to give them a better idea of where this might have been happening. Except there was a lot of different locations in these photos. It seemed like Mr. Swirl Face had been traveling to Cambodia, Thailand, Vietnam, and even South Korea, which made this case way larger and even harder to find him. But they were able to kind of come to the conclusion that he had been mostly in Cambodia and Thailand within these photos. But then they realized that it wasn't just on the USB, it was also online. His images were being sent to other predators on predator forums. They found over 300 photos of Mr. Swirl Face and his victims. And it seemed like he was really well liked among all these predators because he was showing his face. It was like a badge of honor that he was confident that the police would never find him. Many abusers typically go online, especially the dark web, to talk to other abusers. They'll share photos and even give insight and advice on how to abuse children. Sometimes they will even show abusers specific victims that they might be able to abuse if they're in a certain location, especially if a child maybe doesn't have a good support system. Now, even though the dark web is untraceable, predators are still going to try and make themselves very anonymous, so they're not going to use their face. But it seemed like Mr. Swirl was almost unstoppable, except this man was so confident that it seemed like he was not that smart actually, because this entire thing was a lot easier for them to track, it seemed, because he didn't hide his IP address. This man literally did not have a VPN. It turns out he was living in Vancouver, or so they thought. Now, this is really common. Many abusers, especially child abusers, will travel to countries that are a lot more vulnerable as these sex tourists. Sometimes they're not going there to abuse children, they might go there to abuse adults, adult women. A lot of times they like to travel to these places because the age of consent laws are lower. There might be weaker laws. Sometimes the police themselves are corrupt. This is really sad, but sometimes it's common for abusers to come from, Western countries or first world countries and integrate with the community and gain the trust and then reoffend. This isn't really exactly what happened with Mr. Swirl Face. Sometimes these abusers, especially those who are men, will actually have children or women who will be used as bait, as a way to gain trust. This is actually kind of what happened at the very start of this episode. The young boy that would meet the two brothers, he was being used as bait, and he most likely didn't even know what he was doing. He probably had no idea that this man was abusing or was going to abuse them all. I don't know exactly, but this does happen to a lot of children, and sometimes they grow up and they struggle to feel like they're a victim because they think that they're also the perpetrator, but they are children. It's completely different if a victim becomes an adult and then becomes an offender, but when a child's put in these positions, most of the time they don't really know what they're doing, or they might have an understanding, but they have no choice because they're a child. So Interpol was actually getting a lot closer to finding Mr. Swirl, but it seemed like they couldn't get his identity until one of their team members realized that it seemed like Mr. Swirl was probably using Photoshop to make the swirl effect. So they took his photo, they opened up Photoshop, and they threw his face into Photoshop and they used the swirl effect and they reversed it. With some software, when you use a swirl effect, it might remove a lot of the pixels. So it's really impossible to decode the pixels or try and get some kind of image out of it. But with Photoshop, they were able to do it. When they used the reverse tool on the swirl effect, they were able to catch his face. Interpol took this man's photo and they blasted it to every single police department that they had been working with, hoping that maybe he was in one of their databases or he had been an offender previously, but no, they had no one. There was no match. This was a race against time. Interpol knew that they needed to get this man because at this time, he could have been abusing more and more children, and they needed to get his face out there. So they did something that they normally wouldn't do, but they reached out to almost every major news outlet and asked if they could just share his photo and blast it everywhere. And of course, everybody loves a good story of taking down a predator, so almost all of these news stations were like, yeah, let's do it. And soon, Mr. Swirl Face was no longer just this anonymous man, and his face was out there. Within minutes, over 350 people were able to identify him as a 32-year-old man named Christopher Paul Neal. He was a Canadian man who was actually in South Korea teaching English. Many people from the school, including students, were able to identify him and were able to say that he had been abusing other people. So he had been teaching English for some time while also on the side abusing these young boys. It's estimated that he had around 12 victims where he would travel throughout different countries in Asia to take photos abusing these young boys. He even had a MySpace account where it was actually pretty tame. Like, he didn't have anything with this. It was called Loving Asia, where he was just kind of sharing the culture and travel and what he loved about Asia. But to me, it kind of comes across like he's trying to hide a way of being like, oh, this is why I was in Asia and not because I was abusing children. So it kind of looked like he was this normal dude, but he wasn't. And actually, he seemed to be really well liked. So when I was doing my research, I went on the good old Reddit to see what some people had been saying about him. So take this with a grain of salt. This might have not been true, but this person seems pretty likely. So this person had said, my friend worked with him at the school I had left a year earlier. She said he was nice, quiet guy. One day, one of the teachers he was friends with laughed and jokingly said at lunch, hey, I saw you on Interpol right after the picture was unswirled because they thought it kind of just looked like him. The next day, he didn't show up to work and they still didn't suspect it was him. They were worried that he got into an accident on his motorcycle, and then the school was calling hospitals. By the end of the day, news crews were there and they realized what was going on. I just think the idea of working with a predator like that would be so disturbing. I always think about that. How many times do we go to work or we pass people that are these types of predators? So, of course, in 2003, when his picture was posted everywhere and people were contacting Interpol, he knew he had to leave. So he took a one-way trip to Thailand. He shaved off all his hair, put on glasses, and I guess that was his best disguise. So the Thai police had actually received an alert from Interpol about Mr.Swirl Face, and one of the lieutenants would actually send his men to go to Bangkok's red light district where they were talking with a lot of these people in the area, and one of them had actually mentioned that they had actually seen Christopher there with his partner. I was actually surprised to find that this man had a partner the entire time who wasn't that much younger than him. So the police were actually able to track his partner's phone, and it pinned them to a town where they would eventually find him squatting in this abandoned home in the middle of nowhere. He was finally arrested on October 19th, 2007. So, shortly after Christopher was arrested, his family cut all contact with him. Thank God. And so, one of the things I found really shocking, honestly. So, you know how I said it seemed like he just didn't get a VPN? Well, it turns out I don't think he was being neglectful. He was just like straight up trying to frame his brother. So he actually visited his family's home in the early 2000s and he took and uploaded the child sexual exploitation material onto his brother's laptop. which explains why he didn't even use a VPN and was okay with his brother being framed. I don't even know what I would do if my sibling did that. Like, no regard. I mean, obviously, this guy doesn't care, but just that idea. I'm just glad his family cut ties with him, just in general. But yeah. So on August 2008, he was sentenced to 6 years. And at first, he only pled not guilty, but he eventually did admit to his crimes. So he was sentenced to a whopping 3 years and a fine of $1,700, which is a slap in the face to the victims and even Interpol for studying and trying to find where this man was. So it seemed like the Thai police were hoping that they would have him serve only the time for the three boys because they could only prove that, and that when he would be sent back to Canada, Canada would be able to try him for the other countries and have him for a harsher sentence. But how did Canada fail these victims? So in September of 2012, he returned back to Canada and was immediately arrested. And then a month later, in October of 2012, he was released with some strict rules. He couldn't contact anyone under the age of 16, no internet access by a computer or a phone, and he couldn't go anywhere where children most likely are, like playgrounds or schools, and he had to surrender all of his travel documents. And within a year, August 2013, he was rearrested because he was breaching his restrictions. He somehow managed to buy a computer and was on the internet. And when this was caught, Mr. Swirl was basically like, oh, I'm just writing a book. But of course, the investigators were like, well, we need to compensate your computer. This is not allowed. And they were like, we need to go through it. And what do you know? They found 25 other photos of young boys, and he also had his signature swirl face. He apparently had been in contact with another one of his pedophilic friends where they would talk about his persona of Mr. Swirl Face with such high regards. And it seemed like Christopher was really proud of this. So a lot of netizens online have come to the conclusion the swirl is actually a symbol that pedophiles use in forms of media to identify themselves to other pedophiles. So the symbol is like a swirl, it's kind of like a triangle, loose swirl that stands for little boy lover, which is very disturbing as fuck. And a lot of pedophiles will use these types of symbols just to identify themselves, and they're kind of like dog whistles so they can help identify each other. So I'm not too sure if that's exactly why he swirled his face or if this is just, a coincidence, but it does feel pretty similar. He really had no remorse for what he did, and he didn't care for the victims that he had harmed, and he wasn't even sentenced that long. So he really wasn't even punished. Apparently his friend had even showed him the dark web and how to share his content there that was untraceable, and he had even began to share images there. The police did arrest him, but he was only sentenced to another 5.5 years, where he only did 15 months and was released by 2017 because he was basically like, oh, I'm never gonna do this again, I promise. I'm gonna be good. So now he lives in Vancouver. He has more restrictions. He can't contact any minors. He can't have any electronics. He can't have any internet access or having others do it for him. But he is literally free right now, walking around. I just pray that he doesn't have any more victims. But the fact that he was released it's such a slap in the face to the victims because you're not protecting them. And all because what? He was basically like, I'll never do it again. It's just crazy. He served less time than the amount of time he had been abusing children and the amount of time it took them to even find who he is. I honestly wish there was a better way to end this episode and that the victims would have, maybe received a better chance. And I hope that those boys have been able to get help and the healing they need and are doing all right. But this isn't something that someone just moves on immediately. According to missingkids.org, 67% of CSAM survivors have said distribution of their images impacts them differently than the hands-on abuse because the distribution never ends and the images are permanent. And I just think that's really, really heartbreaking. I hope I explained this with as much information and care as I could. Again, we mean no harm to any of the victims in this case. And if you or someone you know has experienced this type of abuse, there will be help links in the description below. Thank you so much for listening.